Welcome to the Upper Room Chapel. I'm Sharon Conley Cottingham, Director of Formational Learning, and I welcome you to this holy space. It is my honor and my joy to be with you today, experiencing the presence of God wherever we are. Wherever and whenever we gather, we come together to pray with and on behalf of the world. And as we gather today, we find ourselves in the United States beginning to emerge from the pandemic of COVID-19. And even as our hearts lighten, we acknowledge that COVID continues in places around the world. And the pandemic of racism continues to rage. As we begin our time of prayer together, let us open our hearts and our minds to the presence of the Holy One. Take some deep breaths, breathe in the love of God, and exhale any tension or worry. The scripture that I'll read today is from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 in the Common English Bible. So then, with endurance, let us also run the race that is laid out in front of us. Since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us throw off any extra baggage and get rid of the sin that trips us up. Fix our eyes on Jesus, faith's pioneer and perfecter. He endured the cross, ignoring its shame for the sake of the joy that was laid out in front of him, and sat down at the right side of God's throne. I've been following a news story. I don't usually follow news stories very thoroughly. I'm not a news junkie. I listen for the essentials and then I move on. I found it an essential practice for a sensitive soul. But I haven't been able to stop reading about, listening in for, and craving more information on the story of the collapse of the condo in South Florida. Perhaps it's because I lived in South Florida for 13 years and I know that beachfront well. I can clearly envision the highly diverse community that shared space together in Surfside. Maybe it's my fascination with the way the first responders and community leaders held on to hope for 2 full weeks as they combed through rubble looking for signs of life. Perhaps it's a resonance with what my mother used to call a heaping. A heaping is when one overwhelming challenge after another comes upon us before we've had any chance to regain our footing, to find solid ground. And this heaping is what we have been collectively experiencing with the overwhelm of the global pandemic, the unearthing of yet deeper levels of unaddressed disdain for each other, raging fires in Canada, political disarray in Colombia, unrest in Cuba, to say nothing of the personal life issues that we're all called to carry. But I think for me, the real compelling part of the South Florida condo story is about a profound sense of our vulnerability in the face of this heaping. Construction, the walls around us and the roof above us, at least for those of us fortunate to live in places where building codes are named and enforced, are supposed to be solid. They're supposed to be reliable. They're supposed to be sure. We're supposed to be able to count on walls standing. A South Florida hurricane might level some construction, but you can get ready for that. You can board your windows. You can insure against it. The roof and the walls of my home are not supposed to crumble on top of me while I sleep in the night. This is not supposed to happen. And yet we live in a world where much happens that is simply not supposed to happen. We long for things to be right, to be as they are supposed to be, and alas, they are not. Apparently stable structures crumble. A global history of racism perpetuates in new forms. Haitian leaders are assassinated. Fires rage. New variants of COVID appear. And we are all vulnerable to the ramifications and to the pain caused by all of these things that are simply not supposed to happen. Our Hebrews 12 scripture text today invites us to run with endurance the race that is set before us. And it strikes me that we're not invited to run the race in an ideal setting or in the setting of our choosing, but in the setting that is laid out in front of us. The one in which apparently stable condominiums crumble. The one in which things happen that are simply not supposed to happen. The verses that precede Hebrews 12 in chapter 11 list many names that we would consider heroes of our faith. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and they're rarely mentioned mothers, sisters, aunts, and grandmothers. The list goes on to include Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel. These are the greats that have gone before us and run this race with endurance, with deep faith in what was promised, with deep trust that someday things will be as they are supposed to be. But the writer also reminds us that no one in that list received what was promised. They endured so many things that were not supposed to be, but they did not experience the fulfillment of that promise. So in lieu of the satisfaction of fulfillment, what is it that fueled their faith? How did they live on and maintain hope against hope that someday things would be as they are supposed to be? And I think we have a strong clue in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. The text reads, Jesus endured the cross, ignoring the shame of it, for the sake of the joy that was laid out in front of him. And I get to wondering, when Jesus envisioned the joy before him, what was it that he saw in his mind's eye? What did he imagine? Because it must have taken quite a bit of imagination to see joy when what was in front of him was political turmoil, the confusion and betrayal of his friends, and death. All of this visibly in front of him. What did Moses see? What did Abraham envision? What about Sarah? What vision captured them so fully that they were able to see beyond what is visible and endure the long list of things that were not supposed to be? One of my favorite writers is George MacDonald. MacDonald was a preacher-writer born into a rigid Calvinist world in Scotland in 1824. His writings profoundly influenced generations of imaginative writers, the likes of Lewis Carroll, Dorothy Sayers, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. MacDonald, in an effort to offer his young children a view of God as loving and gracious, an image in stark contrast to the harsh and judgmental God of Scottish Calvinism, wrote for his children a series of fairy stories, all of which emphasized the eucatastrophe, the surprise and unexpected good ending rooted in belief in a God who loves all. It was MacDonald who gave us the concept of the baptized imagination, an invitation to engage the power of the imagination to see beyond what we can see with our eyes. Jesus models this baptized imagination. His vision, his imagination, enlivened with the color and the detail and the artistry of a grand creator, could see what we often cannot see: a world in which things are made right. I believe Abraham and Moses and Rahab and Joseph too could see beyond what is visible. They could see a world where lions lay down peacefully with lambs, where fighting ceases and there is no need for tears, where there is no suffering, no loss, no devastation. Friends, we are in the midst of a season of tremendous loss, of communal suffering. Buildings have collapsed on top of many of us, and we find ourselves amidst the rubble. It's a normal human response to move quickly into the rush of fixing, clearing out rubble, fixating on exactly what it is that got us to this difficult place, into efforts to make things right, or by force of hand to shape things into what we assume is supposed to be. But I invite you, in the middle of it all, just for a moment, to fix your imagination on the joy. What is the joy set before you? What is the image of the world as it is supposed to be that most informs your vision? What do you see in your mind's eye that will so fill your reservoir that you too can run with endurance whatever is laid out before you? Tell me what you see. Tell me which artists and poets and novelists and rich conversations with friends have helped inform and enliven your vision. What does a kingdom nurtured and sustained by the love of God look like to you? For George MacDonald, one aspect of the joy set before him was belief in a gentle, kind, and welcoming God presence, despite the Scottish Calvinists' harsh view of a demanding God that was more prevalent in his day. MacDonald got in quite a bit of trouble for generating an image of a God figure as a great-great-grandmother with long silver hair, always clad in white, who lived in a secret room in the castle where the princess resided. The little princess, as children often do, found herself in one disastrous plight after another, most of which involved goblins in the night. Things happened to her that simply were not supposed to happen, particularly not to a princess. After one particularly perilous night that involved muck and mud, the princess ran to her silver-haired grandmother and is welcomed, dirt and all, into her grandmother's embrace. The mud and muck of the princess magically transfers to the white dress of the grandmother, where it quickly morphs into red rose petals, an image of grace and acceptance. An image that fueled MacDonald through his own ongoing and grievous health issues, the deaths of several of his children, and relentless vocational challenge and distress. Friends, I invite you in this time of unrest, when pain and suffering are showing up in myriad forms, to make a regular practice of imagining the joy set before you. What is that joy? And is it substantial enough to fill your reservoir? What spiritual practices enliven your imagination? What art making or singing or dancing or walking in the wild remind you of this joy? What pictures and images of the goodness of God do you see in your mind's eye that make your heart come alive? For me, reading scripture imaginatively is an enlivening practice. Wondering what the original writers and readers saw in their mind's eye as the text was recorded, wondering what fueled their creative expression. And we're going to take a moment to do that together right now. To read a text of scripture with attentiveness to the imagination. So I invite you for a moment to make a shift with me, to take a breath, and to invite the baptism of your imagination. I'm going to read a text of scripture twice, and I invite you to engage your inner artist, your imagination, as I read. Let the images of this psalm, Psalm 46, verses 1 through 7, inform your vision and increase your awareness of the joy set before you. In the first reading, pay attention to your senses. What do you smell, see, taste, feel, hear? God is our refuge and strength, a help always near in times of great trouble. That's why we won't be afraid when the world falls apart. When the mountains crumble into the center of the sea, when its waters roar and rage, when the mountains shake because of its surging waves. There is a river whose streams gladden God's city, the holiest dwelling of the Most High. God is in that city. It will never crumble. God will help it when morning dawns. Nations roar. Kingdoms crumble. God utters God's voice and the earth melts. The Lord of heavenly forces is with us. The God of Jacob is our place of safety. During the second reading, I invite you to note what, if any, images awaken joy. God is our refuge and strength, a help always near in times of great trouble. That's why we won't be afraid when the world falls apart, when mountains crumble into the center of the sea, when its waters roar and rage, when the mountains shake because of its surging waves. There is a river whose streams gladden God's city, the holiest dwelling of the Most High. God is in that city. It will never crumble. God will help it when morning dawns. Nations roar, kingdoms crumble. God utters God's voice. The earth melts. The Lord of heavenly forces is with us. The God of Jacob is our place of safety. May the Spirit of the great Creator enliven your imagination with joy today. Friends, thank you for joining us today. Remember, you are beloved, and you are not alone. Go in peace.